Long, long ago, in the far-off, distant year of 2022, I asked if The Last Faith will be the next Blasphemous, and today we're going to answer that very question. First, let's see how The Last Faith compares to Blasphemous, given they have such a similar dark and violent pixel art style. To me, it really seems like the developers of The Last Faith, Kumi Souls Games, looked at the feedback players provided about the first Blasphemous game, and took those criticisms as their primary source of inspiration. The main critique for Blasphemous 1 revolved around the fact that there was only one weapon, and that while it borrowed Souls-like concepts such as altars for bonfires and enemies respawning when you rest, it leaned more into metroidvania territory than adapting a full Souls-like leveling system, allowing for more character customization, or having an array of weapons that each scale to different attributes, like strength, dex, or intelligence. Blasphemous 2 continued with the metroidvania approach, though this time around it offered 3 unique weapons instead of 1. However, the brutality from Blasphemous 1 was missing in Blasphemous 2, given the lack of unique executions that made the first game such a standout. The Last Faith then goes far more into Souls-like territory than Blasphemous, really straddling the line between a Souls-like and a Metroidvania. It's both in equal measure, with even more of the brutality that was present in Blasphemous 1 and all of the customization to boot. Though overall, Blasphemous does have a better presentation, especially in the soundtrack department. While The Last Faith has this classical piano and voice style of background music, which does suit the gothic overtones of the game quite well, it doesn't hold a candle to the compositions of Carlos Viola. That dude is a god, and will always give Blasphemous the edge over other games in the music department. The Last Faith aptly implements a Souls-like leveling system featuring 5 attributes: vitality, strength, dexterity, mind, intelligence, and instinct for firearms. It also hosts an array of weapons, each scaling in those attributes in different ways, resulting in the player having the ability to craft a unique build for a given playstyle across a single playthrough. Visually, The Last Faith certainly comes across as a kind of gothic version of Blasphemous, trading the medieval vistas for more of a Victorian or Bloodborne style of aesthetic. Very early on, you're even given a gun, which furthers the Bloodborne connection, and there's even some cosmic horror thrown in there as well. But instead of simply drawing completely from Bloodborne, it swaps werewolves for vampires, and actually leans heavily into Castlevania territory. Truly an amalgam of these other great games, The Last Faith is basically what would happen if you threw Blasphemous, Bloodborne, and Castlevania into a blender. It's not quite one or the other, but successfully manages to thread the needle across each of these 3 primary influences, with the result being something truly unique. The combat certainly feels familiar if you're a Blasphemous fan, so much so that if you're finishing up Blasphemous 1 or 2, you'll be able to jump right into The Last Faith without skipping a beat. Each of the 13 weapons feels unique and boasts heavy attacks as well as special attacks that consume mana. They're so good in fact that you're bound to want to try different builds and subsequent playthroughs just to be able to utilize them all fully. Firearms also play a role here, with 6 unique guns in particular, from pistols to shotguns, to a bow that blasts a horizontal column of flame. There's plenty of variety to try out depending upon your playstyle, though bullets are a limited resource, so you'll only be able to expend a certain amount of ammo between altar bonfires, but you'll probably pick up a few extra rounds as you go. Spells are another way to engage in range combat, with 16 in total to choose from, spanning 4 major competencies: fire, frost, electricity, and dark. Spells will of course consume mana, which can be regenerated with blue mana items or whenever you execute an enemy. The Last Faith certainly offers up a lot of options as far as combat variety is concerned, so much so that I nearly forgot to mention you also have a power meter that supports 4 possible abilities: parry, shield, rapid attack, and beast mode. Unlike Blasphemous, parrying is limited to the amount of power you have, though it will heal you when done successfully. The power meter will also regenerate simply through combat encounters, making it yet another great addition to an already extensive combat system. I'd also like to quickly mention how good the animations and sound design are in this game, both in combat and when idle. One of my favorite things about this game is how some of the enemies actually taunt the player, which definitely stood out to me as an amusing additional detail.
You're a fine piece of meat.
Boss fights are also excellent here, with an incredibly balanced and fair design, offering just the right amount of attacks to memorize without becoming overwhelming, and checkpoints that appear immediately prior to the fight so there's no need to backtrack. My only advice here is to avoid using the whip for the apostate fight, because holy hell, that one went on forever and ever. You'd think with all the Castlevania influences that the whip would be pretty OP, but it's not. Now, despite the excellent aesthetic and combat mechanics, The Last Faith is not without its flaws. The biggest issue with the game is how it presents itself as having different classes from the very beginning, each with what appears to be their own unique design, but that isn't the case. The only difference the starting classes make is on your initial starting attributes, but you'll always start with the same skin and the same starting dexterity weapon, the Nightfall Blade. This is definitely strange when starting as either a mind or instinct class, as you won't find any mind scaling weapons until much further into the game, and for instinct you won't even start with a gun. As most players have experienced already, the game really leans into the brawler strength build, as fairly early on you'll find the Skull Cleaver that scales really well with strength, and then towards the second major boss you'll find the Ethereal Great Blade down in the crypts. Most strength players will then stick with the Great Blade as their mainline weapon for the rest of the game, but Dex, Mind, and Instinct builds will have to wait until much later to find any kind of useful equivalent. While not quite the illusion of choice, choosing to focus on Dex or Mind builds will require extensive knowledge of the game and when you'll be able to acquire specific weapons in order to plan your build around such occurrences, which really isn't possible for your first playthrough. Lastly, I have two nitpicks, which, while they aren't deal breakers, are fairly annoying. The first has to do with parrying, as it requires holding RB and Y to execute. This special move, parry, shield, or fast attack, should really be mapped to LB instead. Currently, LB isn't mapped to anything, unless you count Beast Mode, which requires LB and RB simultaneously. I know I'd parry a lot more, or use the special moves more often, if it was just mapped to a single button press as opposed to two. Even Blasphemous had a one-button parry, so I'm not sure what the reasoning was behind this. The second is that there are so many flying enemies in this game, and you can't attack upwards. Instead, you'll be doing a ton of jump attacks, which feels a little clunky. That's another thing that Kumi devs should have taken from Blasphemous, as up attacks were present there as well. The simplest way Kumi Souls could fix issues with starting class selections outside of the brawler strength build would be to swap weapon locations depending upon the class selected. Since the strength build has the most ideal weapon placement for early game, it makes sense to follow this model for other classes in order to give them the same semblance of balance. Going back to the Ethereal Great Blade as an example, it's the major strength weapon found relatively early on in the crypts that most strength players will mainline for the entirety of the game. If a Dex build is selected from the start of the game, then the locations of the Ethereal Great Blade and the Severance Reaper should be swapped. Same thing for Mind builds. The Great Blade should be swapped for the Spinal Chain Blade. Something as simple as changing the locations of weapons found early in the progression of the game by making those weapons relative to the selected class would significantly improve starting class viability and make the other builds equally balanced to that of the Brawler class. I'd imagine this would also be a fairly simple change to implement on the development side of things as well, and would make class selection a lot more meaningful than having a slightly different set of starting attributes. Additional improvements to weapon upgrade progression should also be made, mainly around the sheer cost of upgrades and how additional upgrade levels are locked behind exploration or the acquisition of specific blueprints. In general, I feel like the cost of standard and special ore, along with the costs of weapon upgrades themselves, should be reduced significantly. Given that most of the heavy-hitting weapons won't be found until the latter half of the game, there's a big disparity between having already invested in your current weapon and then having to level a new weapon you actually want to start using to bring it up to the same level of parity. Reducing the cost will also allow for more experimentation, whereas currently you'll most likely end up with one fully upgraded standard weapon and one fully upgraded special weapon by the end of the game. Since there are 13 weapons and 6 guns in total, this doesn't make a lot of sense unless your expectation is that the player will spend hours farming XP towards the end of the game if they do want to try multiple weapons beyond the 1 or 2 they chose to mainline. There's also a large discrepancy between when standard ore becomes infinitely purchasable from the blacksmith and when special ore becomes infinitely purchasable from the witch. The blacksmith will sell infinite standard ore after providing him with the second blueprint, which is fine considering this is roughly at the halfway point of the game. However, the witch will not sell infinite special ore until she receives all 4 livers, which can only happen at the very end of the game. This should really occur after you give her the first liver, received after defeating the boss in the crypts. Otherwise, livers 2 through 4 can't be found until the final 20% of the game, making it very difficult to upgrade anything beyond 1 special weapon until that point. On a similar note, I find it odd that the final weapons blueprint, used to upgrade weapons from +8 to +10, is only found right before the final set of bosses. Ideally, this should be moved to Orden's Palace so that max weapons can be crafted before the final 2 areas of the High Walls and the Junis Ministry. Otherwise, the entire back half of the game, from the Damned Ruins through the Junis Ministry, are all tailored for +8 weapons, which seems odd and imbalanced. While The Last Faith certainly could benefit from a lot of quality of life updates, it doesn't stop the game from being incredibly fun, even in its current state. Having spent over 50 hours playing across 3 different builds, I enjoyed every minute spent with the game. It sure has its fair share of quirks, but so did Blasphemous 1 upon release. Similarly to that case, it wasn't until a year after release that Blasphemous got a ton of quality of life improvements with the Stir of Dawn update. It really wasn't until that point that Blasphemous took off and became a cult classic, and I feel like that's exactly what will happen here with The Last Faith. Once improvements are made to class balancing and New Game Plus is added, this game will really take off amongst the masses. Until then, it'll at least be revered by diehard fans of the Souls-like metroidvania genre, or for fans of Blasphemous especially. That's really my main takeaway with The Last Faith. If you love Blasphemous, you will love this game as well. It stands on its own without being derivative, as it pays homage to its influences without being a ripoff. Despite its flaws, it's still engaging and extremely fun to play, perfectly straddling that line between a Souls-like and a Metroidvania. So is The Last Faith the next Blasphemous? I certainly think so, and can't wait to see what's next for this game, albeit DLC or a sequel. For that reason, I'm giving The Last Faith a solid 8 out of 10, and recommending this as a must-buy for fans of the genre, as the game will only improve from this point forward. Oh yeah, and if you really want to avoid farming for levels or weapon upgrades in general, just get a few thousand XP, then pop hungry essence items before picking up your souls dropped upon death. You can get millions of XP in minutes this way, which is more than sufficient for anything you'd ever need to acquire throughout the entirety of the game. Alright, so what did you think of The Last Faith? Let me know down in the comments. And thanks for watching. Now get the hell out of here.
See you in the next one.
But this is one of them. LC F. Who's LCF? Think? Lucifer? Very perceptive for you, senor. Even hell has its heroes.